My wife turned our house into a patriarchy-free zone and ruled my life with spreadsheets. I tracked her power games, filed divorce, took life back. I was looking forward to a quiet evening after a long day. Instead, I walked in to find my living room rearranged like a corporate conference room, complete with a whiteboard covered in what looked like a political manifesto. My wife stood there with her arms crossed, wearing an expression I'd never seen before, part activist, part dictator. "Welcome to our new reality," she announced, gesturing grandly toward the whiteboard like she was unveiling a business plan. "This house is now officially a patriarchy-free zone." I set down my keys and stared at the board. In her neat handwriting were bullet points that made my jaw drop. Equal division of all household tasks, tracked on a spreadsheet. No unilateral decisions without consensus, meetings. Rotation of the TV remote every 30 minutes during shared viewing time. And my personal favorite, all masculine energy items to be relocated to the basement to create a balanced living space. "You're serious about this?" I asked, still processing. She pulled out a thick folder like she was closing a multi-million-dollar deal. "Completely serious. I've been reading about household power dynamics and realized how much internalized patriarchy we've been operating under. This is our chance to create something revolutionary." I flipped through the folder. She'd actually created a point system for chores, a schedule for who could make coffee first in the morning, and, I kid you not, a contract stating I needed to ask permission before rearranging furniture or choosing what to watch on TV. "So, let me get this straight," I said, keeping my voice level. "You've decided to restructure our entire household based on some books you read, without consulting me first. That's exactly the kind of patriarchal thinking we need to eliminate," she shot back. "The assumption that you should have been consulted first is part of the problem." I looked around at what used to be my living room. My recliner was gone. My sports memorabilia had vanished. Even my coffee mug, the one I'd used every morning for 3 years, was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my stuff?" "Relocated to create a more neutral environment. Your chair is in the basement, along with anything that might reinforce traditional gender roles." I walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet. My coffee, gone. Replaced with some organic fair trade blend that probably cost 3 times as much and tasted like cardboard. "The coffee too? Your old brand wasn't ethically sourced. We're making better choices now." I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't even an argument. This was a coup. She'd spent the day dismantling everything familiar about our home and replacing it with a social experiment. "And what happens if I don't agree to these new rules?" She pulled out another sheet. "I've documented several instances of problematic behavior that we'll need to address through the restructuring process. Resistance to change would just be another example of patriarchal conditioning." I read her list. Apparently, changing the channel without asking equal to media dominance. Making coffee without offering to make hers first equal to domestic selfishness. Falling asleep on the couch during her reality shows equal to dismissive of female interests. "You've been keeping a list of my crimes?" "I've been observing patterns that need correction." I had to admire the thoroughness. Even if the whole thing was completely insane, she'd turned our marriage into a social justice project, complete with documentation and accountability measures. "So what's next? Do I get a handbook? A training seminar?" "Actually, yes. I've scheduled a workshop next weekend with a relationship consultant who specializes in deconstructing household power structures." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't about equality or fairness. This was about control. She'd just found a socially acceptable way to micromanage every aspect of our lives together. "And if I refuse, then you're proving exactly why this intervention was necessary." I set the folder down and walked toward the basement door. "Well, I guess I'd better go check on my relocated masculinity." "This isn't a joke," she called after me. "Neither is my reaction to it," I replied, heading downstairs. The basement looked like a storage unit had exploded. My recliner sat in the corner next to boxes of my books, tools, and everything else deemed too masculine for the main floor. Even my coffee maker was down there, unplugged and abandoned. I plugged it back in, made myself a cup of real coffee, and thought about what I'd just witnessed upstairs. This wasn't about creating equality. This was about creating a new hierarchy, with her at the top. She'd just replaced one system of control with another, except this one came wrapped in moral superiority that made resistance seem unreasonable. But here's the thing about control. It only works if you accept it, and I was beginning to realize I had a choice. 3 days into the new regime, I came home to find 4 women sitting in my living room like they owned the place. My wife had arranged the furniture in a circle, and they were all holding notebooks, nodding seriously. "Perfect timing," my wife announced. "We're just discussing breakthrough strategies for household transformation." One of them, a stern woman with short gray hair, looked me up and down like I was a lab specimen. "So this is the subject we've been analyzing." Subject. That's what I'd become in my own home. "Ladies, this is my husband. We're in the middle of his consciousness-raising process." They smiled at me with the condescending sympathy usually reserved for small children or wounded animals. I nodded politely and headed toward the kitchen, but my wife stopped me. "Actually, this would be a perfect opportunity for you to practice active listening. Why don't you join us?" It wasn't a request. I looked at the circle of chairs. There wasn't one for me anyway. "I'll just grab some water and head downstairs." Running away from uncomfortable truths is exactly the kind of avoidance behavior we're working to eliminate. The gray-haired woman chimed in. I turned back. "I'm not running from anything. I'm going to my own basement to avoid interrupting your meeting." "See," my wife said to the group. "Classic deflection through false reasonableness." The women nodded and scribbled in their notebooks like they were documenting a rare psychological phenomenon. I stood there watching strangers analyze my behavior in my own living room, and something shifted inside me. Not toward compliance, but toward complete clarity. "You know what? You're absolutely right," I said, grabbing a chair from the dining room. "I should definitely stick around for this." I placed the chair directly across from my wife and sat down. The women exchanged uneasy glances. "So," I said, looking around the circle, "what breakthrough strategies are we discussing?" My wife looked uncomfortable for the first time since this began. We were sharing success stories about implementing positive changes in our relationships. Success stories? Fascinating. I pulled out my phone. "Do you mind if I take notes too? I want to make sure I'm really absorbing these breakthrough strategies." The gray-haired woman cleared her throat. "Actually, we were just finishing up." "Oh, don't stop on my account. I'm genuinely curious about the methodology." I looked directly at my wife. "For instance, how do you measure success in these transformations? Compliance rates, resistance patterns, behavioral modifications?" The room went quiet. "If this is a scientific approach to relationship improvement," I continued, "there must be measurable outcomes, right? Success metrics?" My wife's face was turning red. "This isn't a research project. It's about creating authentic equality." Authentic equality, I like that. I leaned forward. "So, when you implemented these changes without consulting me, was that an example of authentic equality? Because I'm trying to understand the baseline we're working from." The gray-haired woman stood abruptly. "I think we should continue this discussion at next week's meeting." "Next week's meeting?" I looked at my wife. "This is a weekly thing now?" "We're forming a support network for women navigating household transformations," she said defensively. "A support network in our living room every week." I nodded thoughtfully. "And do the other husbands know about this support network? Are they part of the transformation process too?" The women were gathering their things with increasing urgency. "Actually," I said, standing before they could escape, "I'd love to hear about your success stories. What breakthrough strategies worked best?" The youngest woman looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "Perhaps we should discuss implementation strategies privately first," my wife said quickly. "Implementation strategies?" I smiled. "You know, I've been doing some research too. Did you know that most successful organizational changes require buy-in from all stakeholders?" Fascinating stuff. The women practically ran for the door. When my wife came back inside, the confident revolutionary was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely rattled. "That was completely inappropriate," she said. "What was inappropriate?" "I participated exactly the way you asked me to. You were being deliberately disruptive. I was asking questions about your methodology. Isn't that what consciousness raising is supposed to encourage?" She stared at me for a long moment, trying to figure out how to regain control. But once both people know the game, the rules change completely. "The women were uncomfortable," she finally said. The women were uncomfortable discussing their breakthrough strategies in front of the person they were strategizing about. Interesting. What does that tell us about the authenticity of the process? She didn't have an answer. For the first time since this experiment began, she was the one who wanted to retreat. "I'm going to make dinner," she said, heading to the kitchen. Great idea. According to the schedule, it's actually my turn, but I'm happy to let you take this one. I sat back down in my borrowed chair. I'll just sit here and practice some of that active listening we talked about. She stopped in the doorway. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing at all. I'm just embracing the transformation process. Isn't that what you wanted? The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 and immediately consulted the household task spreadsheet she'd so carefully crafted. According to her system, whoever woke up first was responsible for starting coffee and preparing breakfast. I'd never been an early riser, but suddenly I was motivated. I made the organic fair trade coffee that tasted like disappointment and prepared breakfast, according to her nutritionally balanced meal guidelines. Quinoa bowl with seasonal vegetables and a non-environmentally problematic protein source. I even plated it Instagram-worthy. When she came downstairs at 7, she found me sitting at the table with my own breakfast, consulting a notebook. "You're up early," she said suspiciously. "Just following the system. Early bird gets breakfast duty." I held up my notebook. "I've been tracking my task completion rates. Want to see?" She poured coffee and sat down, eyeing the notebook warily. "What kind of tracking?" "Well, you've been documenting my problematic behaviors, so I figured I should document my progress toward improvement. I've created a point system based on your guidelines." I opened the notebook and showed her pages of detailed charts, task completion times, attitude scores, instances of asking permission before minor decisions. I turned her system into something that would make a corporate efficiency expert weep with joy. "This is very thorough," she said, flipping through the pages. "Thanks. I also noticed some inconsistencies in the original framework that I thought we should address." I pulled out another folder. For instance, the emotional labor distribution chart doesn't account for the mental energy required to maintain the tracking systems themselves. Her coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" "Well, creating spreadsheets, maintaining documentation, scheduling support group meetings, that's all emotional labor too, right? So I've calculated the hours you spend on system maintenance and created a balancing mechanism." I showed her my counter spreadsheet. Every minute she spent organizing our lives had been logged and categorized, meeting planning, list making, even time spent lecturing me about patriarchal behavior patterns. "You can't be serious." "Why not? If we're going to do this scientifically, we need to account for all variables." I flipped to another section. "I've also started tracking decision-making patterns. Did you know that since implementing the consensus-based decision system, you've made 17 unilateral choices? I've documented each one." She stared at the notebook like it might bite her. "What kind of choices?" "Yesterday you decided we were having the support group meeting without consulting me. That's a unilateral decision about our shared living space. You also chose to rearrange the living room furniture again, without going through the consensus process. Those aren't the same thing." "Actually, according to your own framework, they are." I pulled out a copy of her original manifesto. Quote, "All decisions affecting the household dynamic must be made through collaborative discussion." You highlighted collaborative discussion as a core principle. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. "I'm also tracking compliance with the emotional availability requirements," I continued. "The system calls for active listening and empathetic responses during all household discussions. But yesterday when I asked about the grocery budget, you dismissed my concerns without engaging in the collaborative, problem-solving process outlined in Section 3. You're twisting this around." "Am I?" "Because I'm genuinely trying to understand how the system works. If the goal is authentic equality, shouldn't the rules apply equally to both participants?" She stood up abruptly and started pacing. "This isn't what I meant when I said we needed to address power dynamics." "Then help me understand what you did mean. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you created a system that gives you the authority to monitor and correct my behavior while exempting yourself from the same accountability. You're being deliberately obtuse." "Actually, I'm being deliberately thorough. Yesterday you said my resistance to change was evidence of patriarchal conditioning. So I decided to embrace change completely. Every rule, every guideline, every principle, I'm implementing all of it." I walked to the refrigerator where I'd posted my own addition. "I've also created a communication improvement plan. Since emotional labor includes managing household conflicts, I thought we should establish protocols for addressing disagreements constructively." She looked at my addition with growing horror. I'd turned her own language against her, creating a formal process for addressing problematic behaviors that applied to both of us equally. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Is it? Because this morning, when you called my compliance efforts ridiculous, that was dismissive language that doesn't align with the supportive communication guidelines in your original framework." She stared at me, and I saw the exact moment she realized what I was doing. I wasn't fighting the system, I was exposing it by following it perfectly. "You think you're very clever," she finally said. "I think I'm very committed to authentic equality. Isn't that what we both want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coffee and headed upstairs. But systems of control only work when one person holds all the power to define the rules. The moment you apply those rules consistently to everyone involved, the whole structure starts to crumble. Thursday evening, I walked in to find a man in his 50s, sitting in what used to be my chair, apparently retrieved from the basement for this special occasion. He wore the kind of casual blazer that screamed "I charge by the hour," and had the overly earnest expression of someone who takes himself very seriously. "This is Dr. Richardson," my wife announced. "He's a relationship consultant who specializes in helping couples navigate power dynamic transitions." Dr. Richardson stood and extended his hand with a firm consultant school handshake. "I've heard a lot about your situation. I'm here to facilitate some productive dialogue." I shook his hand and looked around. My wife had rearranged the furniture again, 3 chairs in a triangle, pamphlets about masculine toxicity and household equity frameworks on the table. Productive dialogue. "That sounds expensive," I said, taking the remaining chair. Dr. Richardson chuckled in that practiced way consultants do when they want to acknowledge humor without finding anything funny. "I prefer to think of it as an investment in relationship sustainability. And what's your assessment rate for relationship sustainability? Do you charge by the breakthrough or by the hour?" My wife shot me a warning glance. "Look, we're here to address the resistance patterns we've been experiencing." "Resistance patterns," I repeated, settling in. "Doctor, before we dive into my patterns, I'm curious about your methodology. How do you typically measure success in these interventions?" He opened a leather portfolio. "We start by identifying problematic behaviors and developing targeted strategies for modification." Modification strategies. Interesting. I leaned forward. "And do you find that sustainable change typically requires buy-in from both parties, or does your approach focus primarily on modifying one partner's behavior? In this case, your wife has identified specific areas where traditional power structures are creating dysfunction." "Such as?" I interrupted. He consulted his notes. "Decision-making dominance, emotional labor avoidance, and resistance to household equity initiatives." Those sound serious. "Can you give me specific examples of how these manifest in our relationship?" He looked at my wife, who suddenly seemed less confident. "Well, there's the documented pattern of dismissing collaborative decision-to-making processes." "Could you be more specific? Because I've been tracking my own behavioral patterns, and I'd love to compare notes with your assessment." I pulled out my notebook, the same one I'd been maintaining all week. Dr. Richardson's eyebrows went up. "You've been self-monitoring." "Absolutely. If we're going to address problematic behaviors, we need accurate data, right?" I opened to my decision-making log. In the past 7 days, I've documented 23 household decisions. 14 were made collaboratively through the consensus process my wife established. 6 were emergency decisions requiring immediate action, and 3 were made unilaterally by my wife without following her own collaborative framework. Dr. Richardson looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand." "Well, take Tuesday's dinner decision. According to the household equity guidelines, meal planning should be collaborative, but my wife chose to order pizza without consulting me first. That's a unilateral decision that bypasses the very system she created." My wife was turning red. "That's not the same thing." "How is it different?" I asked genuinely. "Because I've been trying to understand the distinction, but the criteria seem inconsistent." Dr. Richardson scribbled frantically. "Perhaps we should focus on underlying communication patterns." "Great idea. Let's talk communication." I flipped to another section. I've been tracking instances of dismissive language. For example, when I asked questions about the new household rules, I was told I was being deliberately obtuse. When I requested clarification about emotional labor calculations, I was accused of twisting things around. "Are these examples of productive communication?" "You're missing the point," my wife said, voice rising. "Then help me understand the point. Because from my perspective, it looks like questioning the system is automatically labeled as resistance." Dr. Richardson cleared his throat. What I'm hearing is some defensiveness around the change process. From whom? I asked. He looked at me like I'd asked a trick question. Well, from you, obviously. Really? Because I've implemented every single guideline in the household equity framework. I've maintained detailed records of my compliance. I've even created additional accountability measures. Which part of that suggests defensiveness? He flipped through his notes, searching for something to support his predetermined conclusion. Your wife mentioned that you've been overly compliant in a way that feels passive-aggressive. Overly compliant. I let that hang in the air. So following the rules exactly as written is now a problem when it's done to make a point rather than create genuine change. Yes. And how do you distinguish between genuine compliance and performative compliance? What metrics do you use to measure the authenticity of behavioral change? Dr. Richardson was starting to look like he regretted his career choice. It's more about the spirit of the changes rather than the letter of the law. The spirit of the changes. I see. I closed my notebook. So when my wife created detailed spreadsheets and accountability measures, that was about the spirit of equality. But when I follow those same measures precisely, that's passive-aggressive resistance. That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? Because I'm genuinely trying to understand how this framework is supposed to work. My wife finally exploded. You're being impossible. This whole thing was supposed to make our relationship better, and you're turning it into some kind of intellectual exercise. Actually, I said calmly, I'm applying the same analytical approach to the system that you used to create it. If the goal is authentic equality, shouldn't we be able to examine the framework objectively? Dr. Richardson started gathering his papers. I think we need to schedule some individual sessions before we continue with couples work. Individual sessions to address what, specifically? My resistance to the therapeutic process? I actually laughed out loud. Doctor, with all due respect, pointing out logical inconsistencies isn't resistance to therapy, it's critical thinking. And that attitude is exactly the problem, my wife snapped. My attitude of asking questions and requesting clarification is the problem? Dr. Richardson stood. I think we've identified the core issue. We'll need to work on your willingness to engage with the process in good faith. I've been engaging in good faith. I've followed every rule, documented every interaction, and asked for clarification when things didn't make sense. If that's not good faith, then what is? Neither of them had an answer. Dr. Richardson packed up while my wife walked him to the door. I could hear urgent whispers about escalation strategies and intervention protocols. When she came back, I was still sitting there. Well, she said, aren't you going to say something smug about how that went? Actually, I was thinking about scheduling my own consultation. With who? A divorce attorney. Since we're bringing in professional help to evaluate our relationship dynamics, I figure I should get a second opinion. The color drained from her face. You can't be serious. Why not? If our problems require professional intervention, shouldn't we explore all the available options? For the first time since this began, she looked genuinely scared. And that's when I realized the power dynamic had shifted completely. Friday morning, I called in sick to work. Not because I was ill, but because I had important business to handle. While my wife was at her job lecturing college students about gender studies, I was methodically dismantling the life we'd built together. First stop, the bank. I opened my own checking account and transferred exactly half of our joint savings. Not a penny more, not a penny less. Equal distribution, just like she'd always wanted. Next, the storage unit I'd rented 3 blocks away. I loaded my truck with everything that actually mattered to me. Tools, books, photo albums from before we were married, and the few pieces of furniture that were mine before we moved in together. Everything we'd bought as a couple stayed exactly where it was. By noon, I was sitting in a lawyer's office explaining the situation to a woman who specialized in what she politely called complex marital dynamics. So she wants equality, the attorney said after I finished. She wants control disguised as equality. And you want out? I want my dignity back. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward. No-fault divorce, equitable distribution of assets, no children to complicate things. The attorney handed me a folder thick enough to end a marriage. She'll probably try to negotiate once she realizes you're serious. She'll definitely try to negotiate. But the negotiation phase ended when she brought in a consultant to fix my personality. I got home before she did and sat at the kitchen table with the divorce papers spread out like a business proposal. When she walked through the door at 5:30, chattering about her day, she stopped dead when she saw the documents. What is this? Your freedom papers. Full independence from patriarchal oppression, just like you wanted. She picked up the top sheet with shaking hands. You filed for divorce. I declared myself a refugee from the patriarchy-free zone and applied for citizenship elsewhere. This isn't funny. You're right. It's not funny at all. I stood and handed her a second folder. This contains a complete breakdown of all the responsibilities you had to handle independently: mortgage payments, utilities, car maintenance, home repairs, yard work. Everything I used to take care of while you were busy documenting my oppressive behaviors. She opened the folder and stared at the list. You can't just leave. Actually, I can, and I am. I picked up my keys. The beauty of your patriarchy-free zone is that it doesn't require a patriarch to function, right? So you should be perfectly fine managing everything on your own. Where are you going? Somewhere I can make unilateral decisions about coffee brands and TV channels without requiring a consensus meeting. We can work this out. We can modify the system. The system isn't the problem. The problem is that you never wanted a partner. You wanted a subordinate you could reprogram to your specifications. She followed me to the door, panic replacing the confidence she'd carried for weeks. You're overreacting. All couples go through adjustment periods. Adjustment periods don't involve hiring consultants to fix your spouse's personality. I was trying to make us better. You were trying to make me smaller so you could feel bigger. There's a difference. So that's it? You're just going to throw away everything we built? You threw it away the day you decided our marriage needed to be restructured without my input. I'm just making it official. I walked out and closed the door behind me, leaving her standing alone in the patriarchy-free zone she decreated, with her spreadsheets, her manifestos, and her complete independence from masculine influence. My phone started buzzing before I reached the truck: texts, calls, voicemails, all variations of the same desperate theme. We can fix this. I was wrong. Please come back so we can talk. But the time for talking had ended when she stopped seeing me as an equal partner and started treating me like a problem to be solved. 6 weeks later, I was sitting in my new place. A simple 2-bedroom house with a garage for my tools and a kitchen where I could drink whatever coffee I wanted. No spreadsheets on the refrigerator, no consensus meetings about TV, no support groups analyzing my behavior patterns. My phone still buzzed regularly with messages from her. The tone had evolved from angry to desperate to pathetic. The latest one arrived while I was grilling a steak on my back patio, something that would have required a sustainability impact assessment in the old system. The house feels empty. I realize now that I went too far. Can we please talk? I deleted it without responding, just like the previous 43 messages. Some people called it cruel. I called it maintaining boundaries. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday. She tried everything to stop it: couples counseling, mediation, even bringing her support group friends to intervene one last time. But you can't negotiate with someone who's already walked away from the table. That evening, she showed up at my door. I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the confident revolutionary. This woman looked tired, defeated, and smaller somehow. I know you probably don't want to see me, she started. You're right. I don't. I just wanted to apologize. I see now that I was trying to control you instead of creating equality. Congratulations. Only took you hiring a consultant and losing a husband to figure that out. I was scared, she said, tears starting. Scared that if I didn't take control of everything, I'd lose myself in the relationship. So instead, you lost the relationship entirely. Strategic thinking at its finest. Don't be cruel. I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. You turned our marriage into a social experiment, and then acted surprised when I refused to be your lab rat. I thought you'd fight for us. I did fight. Every time I asked questions about your system, every time I pointed out the contradictions, every time I refused to accept that questioning your authority made me problematic. That was me fighting for us. I meant fight differently. You meant submit. There's a difference. She stood there on my porch looking lost. So there's nothing I can do? No way to fix this? You can learn from it. Find someone who wants to be managed and controlled, because that's what you're looking for. Just don't call it equality next time. That's not what I want. It's exactly what you want. You wanted a partner who would follow your rules, accept your judgment, and thank you for the privilege of being corrected. That's not a marriage. That's a dictatorship with better marketing. She tried one more angle. What if I proved I'd changed? What if I showed you things could be different? The time for proving things was when we were married. You chose to prove you could restructure my personality instead. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Every day for weeks. You chose to treat me like a problem instead of a partner. You chose to document my behavior like I was a case study. You chose to bring strangers into our home to analyze my resistance to your authority. I was trying to make us better. You were trying to make me smaller. Mission accomplished. I stepped back inside and started closing the door. The patriarchy-free zone you created is still waiting for you. You should go enjoy your independence. Please, she said, putting her hand on the door. I love you. No. You love the idea of reshaping me into someone more acceptable. That's not the same thing. I closed the door and locked it. She stood on the porch for another 10 minutes, but I didn't open it again. Eventually, I heard her car start and drive away. Later that night, I made dinner and watched whatever I wanted on TV. No scheduling required. No consensus meetings. No documenting whether my entertainment choices reinforced problematic stereotypes. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, I could breathe without wondering if my breathing patterns needed to be restructured for optimal household harmony. My phone buzzed one more time. Another message from her. I didn't read it. I blocked the number and finished my dinner in blessed silence. Some people might call it sad that a marriage ended over household rules and power dynamics. But here's what I learned. Respect isn't negotiable. Dignity isn't optional. And equality means both people get to be human, not one person getting to be the reformer and the other getting to be the project. The patriarchy-free zone was finally complete. Population, one very lonely revolutionary who'd won the battle but lost the war. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.